Hi, Year 10 Business Studies students, and welcome to another narrated PowerPoint on human resources. This is section 4 on organisational structures, and today we're going to look at whether or not a business should be centralised or decentralised in terms of its decision making. So this is what we're looking at today. We've done the top part of this slide already, and now we're going to do the bottom part. So how organisational structures affect the way a business is managed and the communication within it. And we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of centralisation and decentralisation of the organisation. Let's start now with a very quick starter, just for 30 seconds. Think of two things that you've learnt on the human resource topic so far. Give it some consideration, get a piece of paper and a pen and jot down just two things you've learnt from the HR topic so far. Okay, so I hope you've learnt a lot about human resources so far. We've still got a few lessons we've got to go on HR, and I hope it's becoming a very interesting topic for you. Some of you may decide that you'd like to pursue a career in human resources, and if you do, you will have a very fascinating, interesting and rewarding career. Okay, but now what we've got to get into is this topic of centralisation versus decentralisation. Now, what is this topic all about? Well, imagine that you ran an organisation that had, for example, 100 shops all around the UK. And you ran that organisation from a head office in Norwich. You've got a decision to make. Do we centralise all the decision making in Norwich? Do we make all the key decisions in Norwich and basically tell the shops what they have to do, what they have to sell, how they have to look, etc.? Or do we decentralise? Do we allow each of those individual shops around the UK to decide what it's going to sell? Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to each, and that's what this particular lesson is going to be all about. Okay, so what this is really all about is where the decisions are made. Now, if we pursue a policy of centralisation, then we are making all the decisions at head office, and it's usually the senior managers of the organisation that make those decisions. However, if we are deciding that we are going to decentralise our organisation, then we are allowing the individual branches or departments or geographical locations around the UK to make those decisions for themselves. And as I've said before, there are advantages and disadvantages to each of those, and we need to look at those advantages and disadvantages. But what this really comes down to is this: how much control do the managers at the top of the structure want to maintain? How much control do they feel they need? Or do they feel there are advantages to decentralising the structure? Can decisions be passed down to workers lower down within the organisational structure? So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of doing each. But before we do that, so here's a little task for you, task 1. Obviously we've got to consider the impact that our decision whether to centralise or decentralise has throughout the organisation. So what I'd like you to do is consider the following 5 key factors and add a sentence of your own to explain how centralised or decentralised decision making can impact on each of these. Consider, for example, the first one, management control. Which is better for management control? Is it centralisation or decentralisation? Jot down your views. What about employee motivation? Are employees more motivated, for example, in those 100 shops that we would have around the country? Are employees more motivated by the fact that they can make decisions, or are more motivated by the fact that there's central decision making going on? What about the speed of decision making? is decision making quicker under centralized or decentralized structures? Again, the flow of ideas. Do ideas flow better in centralized or decentralized structures? And what about the quality of decision making? Are better decisions made within a centralized structure or within a decentralized structure? Now on the next slide there's a template, and you can use that template to fill in your ideas on these 5 factors. And the template is divided up into centralized and decentralized little squares for you, so that you can fill those things in more easily. And here's the template for you. So use this template to jot down your ideas on those 5 variables. Well, I'm sure you're beginning to understand now that when we're considering centralized or decentralized structures, there is actually no right answer whether a company should centralize or decentralize. The only thing we can ever say as business managers is it depends. It depends on an awful lot of things. There are advantages to centralization and disadvantages. There are advantages to decentralization and there are disadvantages. Now let's consider some of those advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages of centralization first. First of all, consistent policies. Because all the policies, all the decisions are being made centrally, then all of the branches, all of the departments, all of the regions within the organization are following the same policies because they're made centrally. There's great consistency in decision making with centralization. So for example, if we had 100 shops around the country, each of those shops would be selling probably the same products because they're purchased centrally, supplied out from central warehouses, and each of the shops receives supplies of the same things. So there's real consistency throughout the organization. Sometimes very, very quick decisions can be made. If decisions are being made centrally by a relatively small group of people, then those decisions can be quick and can be enacted upon very, very quickly. So often speed of decision making is better with centralized structures, but not always. Equally, customers know exactly what to expect. For example, I can think of branches of particular shops around the country. Let's take I don't know, Boots or HMV or H&M. If customers go into those shops, whether they're in Glasgow or London or Cardiff or Norwich, you know pretty much what it's going to look like in there, and you know pretty much what that organisation is going to be selling, because those decisions within those organisations are largely made centrally. And so what we have with centralised decision making is tight control. Tight control over what is sold, tight control over the pricing, tight control over the look and the feel of the shop or the office, tight control over the branding and the brand image of the organisation. So centralisation is good for tight control. However, there are disadvantages to centralisation. The first disadvantage is that there is actually limited local decision making. Now I always think about burger restaurants here. Suppose, for example, you were running a burger restaurant in, say, I don't know, let's say Norwich, and decisions were being made at head office in London. And you found, for example, that in Norfolk there was a very good demand for hedgehog burgers. People like hedgehogs. People like eating hedgehog burgers. But there's only a demand for hedgehog burgers in this area. And you speak to head office and you say, look, I want to sell hedgehog burgers here. Head office says to you, no, I'm sorry, that's not what we're selling throughout the country. We want consistency for what we're selling throughout the country. And therefore that particular menu item is not going to be included. Well, as a manager of a local restaurant in Norwich, you might be saying to yourself, that's a real opportunity missed, because I think there's a great demand for that product here, and I would like to sell it, and I will make a lot of profit. But a decision is being made in head office which runs contrary, which runs against the best interests of the branch in Norwich. So sometimes local decision making is very, very powerful because you can react to local need and you can identify needs within a local market and you can supply them. But you need to be able to make this decision to do that. So you need a decentralized structure. Centralisation can also demotivate local managers. Often a local manager will sit there and say, well, look, what decision making do I actually have? All the decisions are being made centrally, and my role is simply to implement somebody else's decisions. Whereas I would actually like to be making some of those decisions for myself. And so actually, centralisation can be demotivational for local and regional management. And also, another problem with centralised decision making is there's no building up of experience at lower levels because all of the decisions are made by a group of senior managers in one location centrally. That means regional managers and local managers are not developing the experience of researching, understanding, and making those decisions for themselves. So clearly, centralisation has some positive and some negative aspects to it, but equally so does decentralisation, which we'll look at next. So with decentralisation, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages again. Advantages of decentralisation is it empowers local management. Local managers can react to local markets. I'll give you a very good example of it in a moment. But if local managers see an opportunity in a local market, they can react to it straight away. They don't have to ask somebody at head office if they can do it or not. They can just act and take advantage of localized opportunities. So you consider our burger restaurant in Norwich. If there was a huge demand for hedgehog burgers, if it was a decentralized organization and I was the local manager, I can react to that and say, yeah, you know what, we're going to do that. We're going to offer hedgehog burgers on our menu. Leading on from that, local managers are the ones with local knowledge. They can understand their local market, they can understand the differences and the variations in that local market compared to other regions around the UK. This is highly motivational. Local managers feel they're actually in control, that they actually get to make some of those decisions for themselves, and they can have some great successes and some failures, which are equally good for motivation. Sometimes you get things wrong, sometimes you get things right, but a local manager will at least be thinking, I'm in control of what I'm doing here. I don't have to constantly tell somebody in head office or ask somebody in head office if I'm allowed to do something, and I don't have to constantly react to what I'm being told to do by somebody at head office. And again, actually, this can result in quicker decision making, not quicker central decision making in terms of the overall policy of the organisation, but it can be reactive, very, very reactive, highly reactive locally. Very quick decisions can be made locally. If the organisation was centralised, a local manager will have to ask somebody in head office if they can do something, and that individual in head office will then have to get back to them and tell them whether or not they can do it, and that can slow things down. Now, I'll give you a really, really good example of this. When I was watching the television recently, and I was looking at the celebrations for D-Day. And as you know, the British and the American and the Canadian and Free French forces invaded Normandy in 1944 with D-Day. But in the region, there was a very large number of German panzer tanks. There were panzer divisions in that area. Now, the problem with the German army at the time was they had very, very centralized decision-making. Adolf Hitler himself would not allow anybody else to make decisions with regard to the use of those panzer divisions. Now, the local generals on the ground in Normandy, the German generals, wanted to put those panzer tanks and those panzer divisions into the fight straight away. But they were not able to because Adolf Hitler had to make that decision himself. It was very centralized decision making. Now, as it happens, Adolf Hitler as the story goes, had taken a sleeping pill and gone to bed and told his local people in Berlin that it was not to be disturbed. And so consequently, the panzer tanks could not be brought into the operation as quickly as they should have been. Maybe the D-Day landings would have turned out very, very differently if the generals on the ground, the German generals in Normandy, had been able to make a very quick localized decision depending on the local circumstances. But they were unable to do it, and consequently the British, American, Free French, Canadians managed to get a very strong foothold in Normandy, and consequently the Second World War was won. It's a really good example of centralized and decentralized decision making. However, there are some disadvantages of decentralized decision making. Things can get very variable. There's lack of uniformity of service. So perhaps you would go into a particular branch of, let's say, our 100 stores that had decentralized decision making. Maybe you go into a branch in Norwich, and then you'd perhaps go on holiday to Cardiff in Wales, and you'd walk into a branch of the same organisation, and things would look very different and feel very different, and the merchandise being sold would be very, very different. Or if it was a chain of restaurants, maybe the menus would be very, very different. And there's a lack of uniformity, and customers don't quite know what to expect from branch to branch. Equally, there can be very much a focus on local issues, and local managers don't see the bigger picture. They concentrate on what's right for what they feel is right for their market, and they don't do what is right for the organisation generally. And sometimes that inability to see the bigger picture and to see the needs of the organisation as a whole, and to see the way the market is going throughout the entire area within the business, within which the business operates. Maybe they can't see those things as clearly. They can't see those things as don't see those things as particularly important. So there are advantages and disadvantages to decentralized decision making as well. Here's a really, really good example of decentralized decision making. This is a company that you're all very familiar with. This is McDonald's. Now, McDonald's follows a policy of, I'll give you a lovely business word here, McDonald's follows a policy of what's called glocalization. It's both global and local at the same time, glocal. And just have a look at the pictures on the screen here. I mean, we've got some something, I don't even know what that is, the South Korean one. There seems to be some honey involved. I've never seen honey being served in a UK McDonald's. In China, they have what looks to be squid ink buns. The bun is black. Can you imagine that being sold in, say, France, the UK, or America? I don't think anybody would probably really want to buy a black bun, but clearly in China that's quite popular. In Germany, there's a burger there. In fact, it's not a burger. It's more like a sausage sandwich. There seems to be some Frankfurter sausages in that one. The one in bottom left is actually India. You can't see that on the screen there, but the bottom left one is India. That looks to be some kind of curry dish, possibly. The middle one, I don't know where that is, but there is McRice burgers. I've never seen one of those in the UK. And the one on the right, I think, is a tremendous amount of cheese. I think that's from Hungary, that one. And nice bun with what looks to be some sort of large seeds on the top. They look rather nice. But the fact is that McDonald's has the opportunity. Each manager, each region, each country has the opportunity to make the decisions for themselves as to what they sell in those countries. For example, if you go and give you another example, if you go into a McDonald's in France, in Paris, you can buy a glass of wine to have with your burger, which is a really nice idea. The French have decided that no French person would want to go out and have a meal out without the possibility of having a very nice accompanying glass of wine with that meal. So in France, you can buy a glass of wine with your dinner. I think in Germany you can buy a beer. I'm not sure you can in the UK. But what is happening with McDonald's is they're reacting to local need, and they're reacting to local preferences. And so therefore McDonald's is able to be successful in lots and lots of different countries where there's lots of variation in what people want to buy and eat. So McDonald's is a really good example of where decentralized decision making is taking place under the policy of what they call globalization. Okay, so now we've looked at centralization and decentralization. I've got some study tasks for you. Can you please read your textbook resource from page 171 to 173 and take notes, and in particular note down the advantages and disadvantages of decentralization. Create for yourself a revision resource. That might be flashcards or a mind map. Then second task, a nice little case study on page 173. It's only a 4-mark question, that one, so have a look at that one and do the 4-mark question. And then seeing as we're getting to the end of section 4.1, I think we need to bring our thoughts together on what we've studied in HR so far. So please read the case study on Apple's organisational structure. It's an organisation that you're all very familiar with. Many of you use Apple products. That's on page 174 of your textbook. And please answer all 4 questions and make sure that you follow the basic rules. If it's a 9-mark question, you should be writing for 9 minutes. You should be writing about 20 words a minute, so the 9-marker should be about 180 words. Make sure you divide up your answer into nice clear paragraphs. Make 1 clear point in each paragraph. And a nice bit of evaluation, that is reaching a judgment at the end of what you're writing. Conversely, the first question is 2 marks. You probably want to write about 40 words for that one and take about 2 minutes to write it. Okay, so I'll leave you guys to do that revision, private study task, and please could you hand in all that work on time to me, and the deadline will be shown to you on the student closure work in the student closure work file as usual.